a classic Putin move, the master of the Kremlin catching all comers off guard with the sacking of his cabinet, the kicking upstairs of longtime shadow Dmitry Medvedev, and plans for a constitutional reform that the opposition suspects is all about keeping the reins of power beyond the end of his term-limited mandate in 2024. We'll ask about the makeover and the plucking from obscurity of tax office boss Mikhail Mushustin to run Putin's cabinet. With Russia, we seem to be perpetually wondering how to run a sprawling nation that spans 11 time zones, whose fortunes depend on oil and gas, where the leader remains popular after 2 decades in power, but where the economy's sluggish, population growth anemic, and citizens fed up with corruption and mismanagement. A giant with feet of clay? On the world stage, Russia continues to project strength, even when its actions yield mixed results, like when the Libya conference it hosted this week failed to deliver a ceasefire, or when fighting resumed in Syria's Idlib province. What's the true reality? What does the future hold? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the shakeup at the Kremlin. Joining us from the Russian capital, Anna Nemtsova, Moscow correspondent for the Daily Beast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Anastasia Shapochkina is lecturer in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, thank you.
And we welcome back freelance reporter Celestine Bolin. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, who would have bet on the 53-year-old chief of the Russian Federal Tax Service? Aaron Ogunke has more on the confirmation of the new prime minister.
The decision to appoint him to the premiership may have come as a surprise, but his approval by Russian lawmakers less so. Fulfilling widespread expectations, the Russian parliament has confirmed Mikhail Mishustin as the country's new prime minister. A relatively unknown technocrat, Mishustin has presided over Russia's tax service for the past 10 years, where he was credited with modernizing the country's fiscal administration system. Widely seen as someone who could bring positive changes to the country's lagging economy, he has vowed to focus on social issues and improving living standards as president.
The president tasked the government to be at the cutting edge of the country's development, to ensure economic growth and the creation of new jobs. It's the basis for efficient social policy and, of course, without the high pace of economic development, the social development of our country would languish.
In a surprise announcement Wednesday, Vladimir Putin announced plans to expand the power and independence of Russia's parliament and state council at the expense of the presidency, prompting the entire government to resign just hours later. Though the Russian president framed the changes as an effort to strengthen democracy, many observers speculate that he is instead laying the groundwork for maintaining his hold on power long after his final term is up in 2024. It wouldn't be the first time Vladimir Putin used or created loopholes to continue pulling the Kremlin's strings. When his term limits expired in 2008, he swapped to the prime minister's seat, designating his protege Dmitry Medvedev as presidential placeholder until later returning to the presidency in 2012.
Anna Nemtsova, what do you think of the new guy?
Well, yesterday I heard Mishustin's name, and to be honest with you, I Googled him and read about this person. I realized I didn't know much about Mr. Mishustin, and neither did millions of Russians who were wondering for a few hours what was going to happen to the country if the president is turning Russian political arena towards a more Democrat, liberal way, or on the contrary, Russia is going to be even more conservative country. And today we could see that every United Russia member voted for Mishustin, and majority of the parliament, 383 parliament members, voted for Mishustin after President Putin more or less appointed Mr. Mishustin.
Yeah, in a hurry, reporters have been scrambling to paint a picture of him. Now there's the camp that's hailing the public servant who has managed to modernize the tax service, And then there's the opposition, Anna, which has been scrutinizing his personal finances.
That's true. Today we heard reports about Mr. Mishustin's real estate. He owns big house outside of Moscow, which for several years was registered on his name, and then currently it apparently belongs to the Russian Federation. We also could hear reports about Mr. Mishustin's sons who studied at Switzerland's best private schools, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but one thing is clear. That Russian opposition today, Russian opposition's leader Navalny and his team, they will continue their investigations, and they have been doing it for several years very successfully. And the country is used to hearing more news about officials' property, about officials' corruption. At the moment, we still don't know enough about Mr. Mishustin. We can only see that President Putin is very powerful. He can turn the entire course of the country in one day. So yesterday was an exemplary day when the country realized how powerful the president is.
Yeah, we want to welcome at this point to our conversation here in the studio in Paris, former French ambassador to Russia, Jean de Glistiani. Paris traffic could not keep you away. Currently research director at the IRIS think tank, the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. Celestine Bolin, we knew when Vladimir Putin was reelected in 2018 that there would be at some point a reshuffle. We just didn't know when. Why now?
I think like so many questions about Russia, the answers are in the head of one man, and we don't necessarily know how he came to this conclusion. But I think the one thing he said, and that actually Medvedev actually repeated again, was they sense that there is this dissatisfaction with the way things are going. I mean, not just, that there's a kind of a political stifling going on, but also just people in their ordinary life are not feeling progress or particular satisfaction with the way the government is running. So change, even though it's changed to stay the same, which is what I would argue, change sounds good, I think, in Russia right now. I just don't think that people who follow these things are particularly fooled because, as you said, he controls enough to have changed everything in one day. And he's setting up a system to continue to control it past 24.
Yeah, Vladimir Putin remains popular, but Moscow citizens seem to be welcoming the change because, well, his former prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, they really were happy to see him go. What does that tell you, Jean de Glistiani?
Well, I think you had in the Russian history, these last 20 years, you have different type of contract, I would say, political contract between the people and the president. The first contract was, give me the power, I will give you prosperity. The second contract, after the crisis and the annexation of Crimea and the sanctions and all that, the second contract was, give me the power, I will give you the big power status, the return to a big power status. And now we are the crisis is going on, the revenue is falling, and he has to find a new social and political contract. So he had to get rid of Medvedev, which was embodying the old ones. And
how would you define that pact that's coming next?
It will be more social, because the political danger for Putin is not the liberals, is not the left. It's the left, yes, the communists and the nationalists on the other side. And so to sort of to protect his power against these movements, he has to give some social impulse to the Russian government. What he's doing, as you noticed, the speech he made in front of the parliament was 3/4 on social problems, only 1/4 on institutional problems.
You agree with that, Anastasia Shapochkina?
Definitely, for all of the economic problems which are beleaguering Russia since especially the crisis of 2008. Formally, it's the prime minister who is in charge of those issues. And in that case, it's logical to replace Medvedev and as a person who basically failed to deliver what were called the May decrees of 2012 or Putin's political reforms, which a lot of experts wrote for him, and especially failed to raise the status of the poorest. Indeed, those 3/4 of the address to the Federal Assembly were dedicated and focused on the very poor. He really underlined the classes to which it was addressed. And thus we see indeed an overture to the left. After and that's an overture based on the results of the legislative elections. We saw United Day elections in Russia and the municipal elections, where the communists, in fact, gained a lot of ground. And United Russia, even before the elections, people were just dispersing from it not to run under its label and running as independents, because indeed the government and the Duma lost a lot of points. Now, when we're talking about the popularity, that's the two things to distinguish. Looking at the polls, Putin's popularity ratings remain around 67%, while the government, therefore Medvedev's, are vacillating between 20 and 30%. Thus, it is logical to send Medvedev away. Now, let's see the replacement. We do not know yet who will populate the actual government, right? So Putin dismisses the prime minister and he disperses the government. So we don't know who the future ministers are going to be. We only have this kind of one figure, which, like Putin, by the way, in 1999, is coming out of nowhere, right? It's the same comment that Madame Nemtsova made about Mishustin today, a name we're discovering, right? If we bring ourselves back to 1999, that's exactly how everybody was feeling about Putin himself. That's just a side off. But then, who is Mishustin in the core? It's a technocrat, and it's a technocrat who is an economist, is a PhD in economics, right? So a technocrat which is one of the people behind, who were from the very start, from 1998, behind the only truly successful macroeconomic reform in Russia, and which is the tax reform. There is no other economic reform during Putin's term which was as successful as the tax reform. They went really from a barter economy, still before Putin even became prime minister, under Primakov in 1998, which brought eventually to the crisis, one of the factors that brought to the crisis, over-indebted government, the government which was traded with the oligarchs in order, the shares for loans in order to pay teachers and doctors, didn't have any cash in their coffers, to the government which is one of the best in the world in collecting taxes, which turned the economy into surplus economy. And I agree with you, of course, it's the price of oil which is responsible for that primarily. However, this ability to collect taxes, this was not a given at all. And one of the people behind this reform, also digitalizing the tax service, turning it into a service, especially after he became the head of the federal tax service in 2010, were huge steps forward, and the strides which even some Western countries are still behind on. So as a technocrat, as somebody who is now can be given even more responsibility, this is a person who comes from a background of accomplishment, which is kind of a rare accomplishment in the economic real systemic change in Russian economy.
But is he going to have, and I'll put it to you, Anna Nemtsova, that responsibility? Because we're going to see in a minute that that constitutional reform, it's not clear yet if how much power will be in the hands of the prime minister.
That's true. Yesterday, it was very interesting to hear President Putin say that Russian public expect changes. He opened his address from this statement. I was interested to see social study last year. More than 80% of Russians could not remember any significant events that happened. Many named pension reform, which happened actually the year before and not last year. This year begins from very big news. The president yesterday proposed constitutional changes. And the president also invited the public, Russian citizens, to take part in discussing the changes. It's not clear if it's going to be a referendum. Actually, we've already heard that it's not going to be a public referendum, but it's rather going to be some sort of a discussion or even vote for the entire package of these changes. And one of very important changes that we heard from the president yesterday was concerning the next president that comes after President Putin in 2024. And that president is not going to have 4 presidential terms. His power is going to be limited to 2 terms only. And once again, we're going to see if Russian people will have a chance to vote for that change. Another change that was really concerning was the change concerning Russia obeying international laws and decisions of international courts. If Russian people are going to have a chance and vote for that change, we are going to see.
Yeah, so the jurisdiction of international courts superseded.
Exactly. And I mean, I think, the thing that we focus on is the right to be able to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, which has cost Russia a lot of money because they've lost on many occasions. So, I mean, that's actually, to be honest, not probably an issue that most Russian people think about, but it matters in terms of human rights progress in Russia. I think also there's sort of weird little things in the constitutional changes that there can also be changes in the top courts. Judges can be removed without any kind of procedure not clear what the procedure would be. I mean, there's, and I think the point of this is that I think it's wrong to focus on the Medvedev because he didn't really have any power. Putin has the power, and what he's doing is making sure that he'll keep it.
All right, we'll talk about that when we come back. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Vladimir Putin's shock announcement that he had sacked the government on Wednesday, replaced or kicked upstairs, if you will, his longtime Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, naming a technocrat in his place and preparing constitutional reform. We're talking about it with Daily Beast Russia correspondent Anna Nemtsova, who joins us from Moscow. Welcome back as well to former French ambassador to Russia, Jean de Glistiani, research director at the IRIS think tank. We're with journalist Celestine Bolin and with Anastasia Shapochkina, who is with the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. And, well, during the break, we were sort of still trying to piece together what is exactly in that constitutional reform plan. Well, going on what Vladimir Putin said in his speech on Wednesday, here's what Peter O'Brien reported.
The Russian constitution, adopted in 1993, abolished the Soviet system of government. Under it, the president cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms, but wields significant power. He or she appoints the prime minister, top judges and the cabinet, is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and can issue decrees enforceable by law. Under Vladimir Putin's proposed changes, the president would have less power and parliament would have more. Instead of the president, lawmakers would name prime ministers and the cabinet. The president would retain the right to dismiss these officials, would still decide who gets top defense and security jobs, and would still be in charge of the Russian military and law enforcement agencies. The powers of the State Council, an advisory body currently chaired by Putin, would be expanded. Other proposed changes include giving the constitution priority over international law, a review of the presidential term limit, and stricter residency requirements for presidential candidates and other top officials. Putin says these changes should be put to a nationwide vote.
Yeah, those stricter residency requirements for running for president. 25 years continuously, you'd have to live in Russia if you wanted to run for president. What's that about?
Well, it's a new element of choice for a president. I would say, on the long run, when you look at the feeling of the Russian population, we have to know that the memory of the democratic period, that is Yeltsin period, is horrible. It meant mafia almighty. It meant corrupt government. It meant pension not paid, and so on. So democracy for Russian is a dubious message. And Putin thinks that he has to, little by little, accommodate. He knows that democracy is something more or less good, his way, of course. But when he tries to give more power to the parliament, of course, it's transitional.
Is it really to give more power to parliament?
Yes, indeed. I think he was struck by what happened in Kazakhstan. Nazarbayev decided to withdraw, but he withdrew in a framework which he built, which was a framework which assure him to keep the power. And so he is the head of the nation and the father of the nation. He is the head of the National Security Council and so on. He appointed, he was elected in fact, but he appointed a new president and it's all fine. And so you have a transition which is mild, and that sort of authoritarian country needs a mild transition.
But I guess my only problem is I'm not sure whether it's a transition to anything that we can identify. Because actually I don't think that the parliament will walk away with so much power. Because at the end of the day, I think that what will happen is the power will seep over to the state council, which he will head. He also runs the military and the police. He runs a lot of the key things. And also the parliament, as we've seen today, is not an independent body.
Yes.
I mean, 90%, whatever, 100%
Yes,
voted for his choice. So who controls the parliament is the question, not so much whether the parliament controls anything else.
No, I agree with that. But it's part of the transition, because the first parliament will be obviously from a united Russia, and perhaps the second one a bit less, and the third one. It's an evolution.
Anna Nemtsova, will Putin pull a Nazarbayev like Kazakhstan's longtime leader, leaving the presidency but putting himself in charge of a body that's above everything else?
Well, this is a very good question. Yesterday, as I was reporting my story, I spoke with probably a dozen experts, and I must say majority were quite upset about the changes. They've been observing Putin's Russia for 2 decades. And most people said that tomorrow we are going to wake up in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, or even maybe in Turkmenistan, some said. So majority of experts I speak with say that Putin boosts his power by these decisions and prepares his ground for what is going to happen in 4 years. We don't know which position Vladimir Putin is going to take in 4 years' time. It could be the head of this new agency, or maybe the head of United Russia-Belarus state. There are different versions. But one thing is clear to everybody, it seems, that President Putin is not going to leave, retire, and continue living his life somewhere in a nice, beautiful house with a great view, sea view maybe. It looks like President Putin is going to remain the most powerful man and the richest man in Russia.
Yeah, that's been talked about as well, the idea of merging Belarus and Russia?
Yes, that scenario has been talked about a lot, excitingly, during 2019. Experts in Belarus specifically were expressing that a lot of the doubts about it on the Belarusian side, of course. So President Lukashenko of Belarus wasn't at all keen on the idea. The negotiations about merging both the codes of law, the parliamentary systems, and eventually the 2 states was aired for a few years now, especially over the last year. The negotiations were taking place over the last year and eventually came down to nothing. At the stake for Belarus were the price of gas and the contracts of Russian oil for refining and for exporting. And eventually they reached an agreement that only probably a merger of the code of law would happen. However, even that administratively can take decades. So Lukashenko won that battle. Today, in the address, there was no more talk about, in the address to the Federal Assembly, there was no more talk about this unified nation. There was no more talk about that at all. However, what was said during and after the address about the new configuration of, so to say, bodies, not so much institutions, we can say, but maybe bodies, governing bodies, is interesting. So indeed, to come back to the Duma, right? There are two ways of looking at it. Has Duma gained power or not? What was said, and everything which was said will have to be declined then later into, written out in federal laws. So that's going to take some time before we can see clearly. And that's why also the whole speech was advanced by 2 months vis-a-vis its regular time. But what first thing is Duma? Duma only gained the power to appoint the prime minister and the cabinet. Well, before it was approve or co-approving, what president proposed. However, clearly it's not going to be the Duma's initiative. They're not going to be picking the candidates. They're going to be changing the term. However, as for the real power, unlikely that it's going to come up to this. Then the Council of Federation, so the second chamber of parliament, they gain in power in a sense that then they get to also to appoint to make certain appointments. President gains in power, especially of security services. Of Council of Federation, security services appointments, very important, especially for Putin, who values security above everything. But the president gains a lot, of course, on paper, so to say. There is this change of the presidential terms, etc. But Putin has already served. He's been already in power for 20 years. He's likely to be positioned. He's likely to remain there for the next 4 years unless gets hit by a boss. And the president now gets to dismiss the judges of the Constitutional Court and of the Supreme Court, because Russia has 2 courts of this type of value. Dismissing, well, before they were appointed, and for life they would remain. So now he appoints, and the Federal Council of Federation appoints them, but then it's going to be with the president in any case. And then he dismisses that, which means that total power concentration in the hands of the president, no longer even factual, juridical.
Does that change anything? When we have the yearly call-in show, people saying that it's the only way to get the elevator fixed is to get in their building is to get a call in.
I think it's going to be even more so, because if you look at the other points of the address, what Putin is saying about the municipal government, because that's what you are now hitting at. You see, in Russia there is always this balance between the center and the regions, or the center and the local government. This is what during Yeltsin time the regions were very powerful. During Putin time is the vertical of power, and the only question remained after the governors' elections are pretty much under the control of the federal government now. The only question remained about the municipal elections. And you saw how it can transpire. It can transpire notably in the results of the Moscow municipal elections, when United Russia lost, when all of the unknown people came to power. It was totally a surprise. Now, the result of this is the address. When Putin's saying, it's no good that there is this, who should take care of the elevator? The local government, right? It's no good that these people are still kind of in the air. There is no cohesion among the municipalities. If everybody's doing their own thing, we have to integrate them so that they are kind of more evenly governed. And then finally, let me finish it with one more point. So not only this is sucked into the vertical, is going to be sucked into very firmly into the vertical already. Financially it's sucked into, but it's going to be even more so. And finally, the prosecutors, regional prosecutors, which used to be appointed at least de jure by the local, by the regional governments, now they're going to be all appointed by the president and the Federal Council, the regional prosecutors. This is as well in the address.
All right, we were talking...
So concentrating fully judicial power.
We were talking in part one of our discussion about how the president's popularity remains high, according to the Levada Center. 68% for Vladimir Putin, numbers Western leaders would kill for, but it is down from the highs of a few years ago, particularly after the annexation of Crimea. Celestine Bowen, you were in Russia over the holidays. How are the optics different whether you're with the hipsters in Moscow or if you go outside of the Russian capital?
I mean, I think it's a generational thing as much as it is a location thing. I think definitely the cities, Petersburg and Moscow, are stand apart. I think, I think for a lot of people that they've sort of reverted to a Soviet mentality, which is it's not just you give us we give you the power and you give us wealth. It's like, you're like the weather. You might change. I just got to get on with my life. I've got to kind of do these things. I know who I have to pay to get certain things done. Corruption has gotten worse, I would say, very clearly to me anyway, since the 90s. And I think that, it's just they're playing their games up there. Just please don't bother me. That I think is true, except for local issues where we have seen in the last year, cases where it does affect their lives. People will go out, they will protest, whether it's a park or it's a garbage dump, or, in the case of the Moscow elections, it was actually, interestingly enough, about the right to have a voice. And I think, these sorts of things bubble along. And I think that when we talk about the change that they perceived was needed by a population, that was part of it. I would take one other issue. I think that it's really easy to make Medvedev the scapegoat of a system that isn't functioning, not because of Medvedev, but because of a whole system created by Putin.
Anna Nemtsova, I see that anti-corruption campaigner, opposition activist Alexei Navalny's been furiously tweeting over the last 24 hours. Is someone like that a threat to Vladimir Putin or just a mere annoyance?
I don't think that Navalny personally right now is a threat to Vladimir Putin, but something that Russian old generation of politicians completely miss at the moment. They do not really pay attention to the brain drain, the young people escaping the country. Almost 50% of Russian youth say they would like to live abroad, and this is a very sad sign. Something that we remember happening back in the 1990s during the crisis. So on the surface, when you walk around Moscow, you see these beautiful parks, you see beautiful pavements. They have really wide now pedestrian walks and really beautifully illuminated streets during this Christmas season. But on the other hand, we see somebody like, you asked about hipsters, the most popular blogger, Yuri Dudz. He says that, look, we should try to stay, the ones who stay in Russia, and become more serious about self-development, educate, self-education, think about our future. But unfortunately, when I speak with students around universities in the regions, the best students dream of leaving Russia. And this is a very serious issue, something that Vladimir Putin did not mention in his address yesterday.
He didn't mention that, but he did mention the issue of how to replenish the population. In 1992, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were 148 million Russians. A quarter of a century later, there's still 4 million fewer. The low birth rate prompting the president to announce new subsidies for families that have more than one child.
Our historic duty is to face this challenge, and not only to get out of the demographic trap, but to ensure stable natural growth of the population by the middle of the coming decade.
Jean-Luc Bristiani, listening to Anna Nemtsova talk about the brain drain, when you hear Vladimir Putin talk about the population problems, what does Russia do?
Well, regarding population, it's true that now we are coming to the, I would say, the scarce population which was born during the Yeltsin period. So there are no babies because no mothers. And we know that when you inject some money, it works. And the previous experiment was positive in that sense. So, but it's not enough. And I think you had some very catastrophic provision from the UN, from different institutions and so on. But it's not true. Russia will remain at the level around 150, 40, 50 million people. And the rest will come from migration, of course, as in France, as everywhere. And now they begin to understand that. And that you have a new policy for immigration. So I think this question is not so important, in fact, for Russia. on the long run. And regarding the brain drain. Well, the brain drain is, of course, is a true phenomenon. The problem is that Putin has a huge level of support in the population as a whole, but what we call the creative class doesn't support him. And the creative class, it's the future of the country. And they understand that perfectly well in the Kremlin. And they try to find some way to attract them and to keep them in the country. And, you know, I think it's nature which will solve the problem, that the change of generations.
Well, I think the change of generation is seen as a problem for the Kremlin right now. So that's one thing. And the other thing is...
Unavoidable.
And unavoidable, exactly. But the other thing is that I think we were talking about his opposition. I think that the issue we're also playing out here is how he protects himself, not so much from the Navalny's, and not so much from the communists, and not so much from, the liberals or the nationalists. It's from his own people. He has to worry about his succession to make sure that a rival doesn't set himself up within this kind of moving kaleidoscope of power structure. And I think that it's not about one person. I mean, it's
the rival could come from within the Kremlin more than outside.
Yeah.
And I think he has to make sure, because I think the thing that they worry about, the Nazarbayevs, the Yeltsins, by the way, and also Putin, is if somebody comes along behind me, am I going to end up in a court somewhere? You know, am I going to be tried for stealing or for worse? Or, you know, so I think we have to think in terms of that kind of mentality. We need to protect ourselves and our group of people.
Anastasia Shapochkina?
I fully agree with this. Definitely security has been on the mind of Yeltsin when he was choosing his heir, so to say, and then it's definitely on the mind of Putin. The very reliable person for Putin turned out to be Medvedev, and he passed the ultimate test. He sat in Putin's chair and he was able to get up and walk out of it. He kept the chair. That was unprecedented. And the transfer of power historically in Russia has been an extraordinarily difficult issue. It has almost never been good and easy. So that's why when we get back to Medvedev, which was not in the address to the Federal Assembly, but which was the announcement made in the afternoon, the dismissal of Medvedev, and then where does he go? And the creation of a special position for Medvedev within the National Security Council. And that's where we get to this kind of institutions or places for governing. If we look at the Kazakh scenario, which we shouldn't dismiss, I think, maybe it's not going to be exactly like Kazakhstan, but that's definitely something that was in mind with all of this reshuffling. Then the the National Security Council would be one place where both the president would be sitting, because it's President Putin who is chairing the National Security Council, and then the special new position, unprecedented, non-constitutional, not in the laws, just reporting to the president, accountable only to the president, appointed and dismissed by the president alone, is being created for Medvedev, the very, very reliable person, the person who's passed the ultimate test. Now, so that's why it is been viewed as a promotion, although from a de facto point of view, he's been the prime minister number 2, right? So Putin's number 1, prime minister is number 2 constitutionally today, according to today's constitution. Number 3 would be then who today is the secretary of the National Security Council, so Nikolai Patrushev. Now inserting Medvedev there makes him in theory number 3, and then Mishustin number 2, right? However, Medvedev in himself is being inserted pretty much as number 2 in the most important organ of power in Russia today, the National Security Council. Look who is populating the National Security Council. All of the security agencies. So Putin is the only leader of the president of that, the kind of this presides, he's the head of that. And now Medvedev
is making sure nothing bad happens to him. We're running short on time.
And precisely this is addressing that point. He's making sure that the security sector is being under his control through putting Medvedev there, kind of second in charge.
Better to be Kazakhstan than Angola, where after the handover of power, your children find themselves indicted. Just before we go, Anna Nemtsova, Russia. How many times on this set have we talked about Russia expanding its influence abroad? In the Middle East, in Africa. Results, though, can be mixed. We saw this past week Moscow hosted a Libya conference that brought together all the main players. Everyone, when the conference began, says, oh, look, Russia's done it again, what the others can't do. They get everybody around the table. Of course, we know what happened afterwards, which is that General Haftar refused to sign a ceasefire, and it ended inconclusively. What are your thoughts on the way Vladimir Putin is perceived outside of Russia today?
Well, we can actually have the key question, right? If Russia is back as a global player, and in fact, Russia is in the Middle East. Russia obviously is sort of playing and demonstrating its muscles, its army muscles. If you watch a Russian television channel Zvezda, which is the defense ministry's channel, almost every day you see some big military operations, tests of new weapons, of new hypersonic rockets, missiles. Yesterday there was a report about the operation in Syria, where Russian defense provided security for the Idlib civilians walking out, hundreds of people. So in fact, a lot of my friends, me, myself, many Russians would like to see Russia becoming a sort of a global peacemaker. But is it going to happen, really? Is Russia going to play that role? This is, I asked a military expert, Alexander Goltz, yesterday, and he said, not during my life. Because to be a peacemaker, to play this serious role, first you need to reform your political system. There is no one-way road. You really need to first reform the Kremlin and the power in Russia.
And we'll have to leave it there for now. So much more to talk about. I want to thank you, Anna Nemtsova, for joining us from Moscow. You're reporting in the Daily Beast. I want to thank as well Celestine Bolin, Ambassador de Gliniesti, excuse me. We'll get it right eventually. And Anna Shapochkina for being with us. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.